All right, on to Locke's psychological view in this second part of the lecture, or a second lecture here on personal identity and the question of answering what am I? So Locke's psychological view is another view in the sort of mind theory of what it is that I am. We just finished talking about Cartesian dualism and the idea that what I am is some kind of soul or mental substance. Locke's psychological view says, Locke was a kind of materialist, right? So he didn't accept that, the mind and the body were necessarily separate in certain ways. Like separated in that he thought, you could explain the mind in materialist terms, maybe, but that doesn't mean that I am a material object. What Locke thought was, constitutive of you, what you were, was a certain kind of psychology, a certain kind of psychological continuity. And so the idea here was that you're a conscious psychological agent, and you persist over time by being continuous with yourself. That is having the same kinds of memories, goals, desires, beliefs, and other kinds of psychological entity like things over time. As long as those things continue, then you continue. Now, this view is that what's important really to personal identity over time is one's psychological continuity, right? So you are the same person as the child that you once were because you're psychologically continuous with that child. You share memories with that child. Your goals and desires have developed out of that child's goals and desires. Your beliefs and knowledge have developed from that child's beliefs and desires. Your beliefs and your goals, your knowledge, they've all developed out of that child's beliefs, goals, knowledge, etc. So the thought here is something like bodily continuity isn't really what matters, right? It's not that your body over time, because clearly like the thought is like, look, you are very dissimilar to the child that once was there. In fact, all of your parts have probably changed. All of the cells in your body that you had as a child have probably, died and moved on, or at least all of the atoms in those cells have been swapped out. So it's not bodily continuity that matters between the child that once was and you now. It's that you have the same psychology, that your psychology is in some way continuous, and that continuity is what establishes, or it's in virtue of that continuity that you are the same person as that child. One intuitive reason for thinking that this is like a plausible view is the metaphysical possibility of what we might think of as body swap scenarios, right? This has been, shown in like the movie Freaky Friday, or I think Locke's example is The Prince and the Pauper. There might even be an old Disney movie where they do the Prince and the Pauper kind of thing, where these kinds of cases work where, somebody goes to bed, or two people go to bed after something funny has happened, and they wake up and, in each other's bodies, right? The idea is something somehow, somebody's psychology has been transferred from one body to the other, and then the two people go on some hijinks adventures where the young person has to do the things that the old person would be doing, and vice versa. um, at the very least, so at least imaginatively, like in the imagination, it seems possible, at least in some weird way, that somebody's psychology could be swapped with somebody else's. And if that seems plausible, I mean, at the very least, the thought is, if it's possible for psychology to be swapped, like the question is, okay, so in this case, you've got Lindsay Lohan and was it Jamie Lee Curtis? Imagine, if the movie is true, then Lindsay Lohan's mind is in Jamie Lee Curtis's body, and Jamie Lee Curtis's mind is in Lindsay Lohan's body. And then if I ask you, where's Lindsay Lohan? Then you have to point at Jamie Lee Curtis, right? That's like the intuitive answer. If you point at Lindsay Lohan's body, but it's got Jamie Lee Curtis's mind, like you've got the wrong person in the scenario, right? If I ask you where's Lindsay Lohan, and that they've been swapped, that's supposed to be how the whole thing goes, right? The person where the person is, it goes with the psychological capacities, the memories, the act, like the proclivities, the desires, the ways that they act, the ways that they think, not the body that they're in. So if, the body swap scenario is at least like the metaphysical possibility of body swaps seems like evidence that, the psychological view is on the right track. If it's possible if body swaps are like genuinely possible or just even theoretically possible, it seems like the only way that we can make sense of that is if, deny that, it's possible, like the body thing is, the bodily continuity is what matters, but accept that psychological continuity is what matters, right? Because psychological continuity from one to the other body is what's going on here. Now, there are some initial problems, or I mean, maybe, for the psychological view. So here's one: Phineas Gage, who you may have heard of. Phineas Gage was this guy who was working on the railroad, and he was apparently like, kind of normal, hardworking fella. And then a serious accident happens where a railroad like pole spike thing ends up going through his head, right through his like eye and into his brain. But he survives miraculously. However, a good chunk of his brain ends up getting, damaged, and it actually ends up drastically changing his personality. So it's a sort of interesting sort of case here, right? Where, well, it seems like, damage to the brain causes a change in personality. So if you think that somehow, a person is their psychology, and you think that Phineas Gage before and after the train spike accident is the same person, then it seems like, it seems like physical effects, like the actual physical effects of the actual physical stuff is what is changing his personality, even though he's the same person. And so you might think, oh, psychological views got to be out because, clearly it's an effect of in the physical way that, is changing his psychology. And so it really doesn't matter psychological continuity. What we need is like, brain continuity or something like that. But you might also think, no, the psychological continuity here is actually good. The psychological view is good because it's possible in a sense that, Phineas Gage just changed. It became a different person, like a wholly different person, right? The idea being like, it's like somebody that goes through a bout of amnesia or something really extreme after a certain serious head trauma. Like they literally have become a different person. They have lost some of their psychological capacities, and they're no longer the same person that they were. And so, Phineas Gage, after being hit with the rod, and when he becomes, he becomes much more angry. He becomes much less, able to like. He loses his work ethic. He just becomes, a totally different person. And that is a result of the the brain change. But ultimately, the idea there is like, no, look, he just stopped being who he was. He had the same body, but the person is gone. The person that was Phineas Gage before the railroad spike incident is just gone, and now we have this other person who it has a slightly different psychology that is a result of some brain damage. What about sleep, though? Sleep is like, at least initially, a seemingly big problem for the psychological view, because every night we go to sleep and so lose consciousness, right? We lose consciousness and then we wake up and we remember what we were, who we were yesterday. And but is it really the case that if I am my conscious self, if I am my psychological continuity, then don't I lose psychological continuity like every single evening? Or what if I like black out? What if I get hit on the head and I black out? Did I stop being me? Did I go out of existence and then come back into existence when I gain consciousness again? um well, I'm not really sure. It's an interesting question here whether or not the uh, psychological view can actually deal really simply with this problem. I mean, it might be the case that we can be continuous psychologically, even if we lack conscious awareness, right? It could be that, really, it's not the case that we need our conscious awareness to be continuous while we're dreaming or anything like that. It's just that we need the underlying psychological mechanisms to be continuous, right? So like the ability for us to be conscious needs to be the same. The ability for us to express our beliefs and desires and the ability for us to think in specific ways. I mean, oftentimes, these are called dispositions. And dispositions are like properties that we have that are kind of lying in wait, right? Like, I believe, like, you all believe, let's see, you all believe that grass is green, but you haven't been thinking about the fact that grass is green for probably a long time. Like, who does that? Nobody thinks about the fact that grass is green very regularly, but you have the capacity to think about grass being green and to believe that grass is green. But it's not something that's enacted at all times in your psychological awareness, right? You're not always, even though you believe that grass is green, you're not always thinking about it. So maybe in this case, maybe your general psychological continuity is undergirded by certain general psychological mechanisms, and as long as those mechanisms continue to be the same and unhindered, then maybe you do stick around from time to time, as long as those mechanisms stick around. But there are bigger problems with the psychological theory. In fact, there's a couple of huge problems, and one big argument that I'm going to present that I think is pretty difficult for the psychological theory to deal with. The first problem worth talking about is a transitivity issue. So transitivity is the idea that, here's a transitivity, here's an instance of transitivity. If A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then it turns out that A is taller than C also, right? Transitivity works that way. It's like, if one thing is more of something than another, and then that thing is more of something than a third thing, then the first thing is more of that whatever to the third thing. It's just sort of obvious, right? Well, so now we've got the same kind of transitivity issue here with respect to identity. Identity is supposed to be transitive. That is, if A is identical with B and B is identical with C, then A should also be identical with C, right? It's not going to like lose it. And on the psychological theory, at least like on Locke's version of the psychological theory, there's this memory requirement. There's this memory requirement that somehow, it's you can grow your memories or you can get more memories, but as you have to keep your memories in a way in order for you to be psychologically continuous with things that were before you. So, one way of thinking about it is something like this, right? So the issue, take this example. So Bob is an old man now, and he was once a schoolboy, and he after he was a schoolboy, he was a young military man, but now he's a retired farmer. Now, Bob will share some of his memories with his younger self, but he's not going to end up sharing all of his memories with his childhood self, right? And the reason for this is that, it's possible to forget things, right? So, Bob as a child probably, remembered the color of the school that he went to. And Bob as a, young military man, continued to remember that thing, that color, right? Now, Bob as a military man and Bob as a retired farmer maybe share some memories as well about, like what happened in the war. But ultimately the issue here is that those memories of what happened in the war maybe ended up replacing the memories of like in the long term, replacing the memories of the color of the school that the Bob the boy went to. Now this seems like an issue because the fact that Bob Senior could forget memories that Bob the youngest had and that Bob in the middle has, well, then it seems like in some way, that it's not the case that Bob A and is identical with Bob C, because Bob A and Bob C don't share memorial continuity, right? Bob A and Bob C need to, it seems like, share memorial continuity for the memory theory, the memory aspect of the psychological theory to work. But it's just not clear that it does. So maybe in this case, like what can we do? Well, maybe we just need to augment Locke's theory and get rid of the memory requirement. I mean, because it does seem pretty obvious that people forget things, and so it's possible for two stages of your life to have the same memories, but then at a later stage to have forgotten those memories. And it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that's going to change you as a person just because you've forgotten something. So yeah, maybe this isn't right at this point. Some bigger issues, or sort of a bigger set of cases that create a huge issue, I think, probably the biggest issue for the psychological theory, are what we would maybe call fission cases. Now, fission cases are a little bit far-fetched, they're a little bit science fiction-y, but they create the sort of real problem that the psychological theory seems to have. And so let's, get into the thought experiments on the fission cases. There's a few of them, a few variations to kind of shake up your ways of thinking. So suppose that we come to have a machine. I mean, so there's a few different fission cases. The first one is this sort of simple one. Suppose we come to have a machine that can scan your brain and construct a perfect duplicate of your consciousness. And then now suppose we can like upload that consciousness into someone else's body, or into like onto a computer, or into like a cyborg. And so like when you are ill, like you're severely ill and on your deathbed, we can scan your consciousness and upload it into a body of like, somebody that like they died in a horrible car accident, but like their body was pretty much fine. And so, they just fix the body and then upload the consciousness into, oh, so like, look, we're just kind of moving you. It looks like, hey, like you're going to survive your bodily death in that case, right? Like you're thinking like, oh, cool, we've got this new machine that can scan the brain and sort of just upload the consciousness, duplicate the consciousness over one body. Now, but wait a minute. What if in such a case, this whole thing happens, but then miraculously you survive being ill, right? You survive your deathbed. And now what's going on, right? Like there's this new person, this new body that has your consciousness and is psychologically continuous with you. But then you are also there and you're psychologically continuous with you. So what gives, right? Like who's identical with you? I mean, clearly you that survived the deathbed have got to be identical with you, right? I mean, it would be crazy to think that just because we scanned your consciousness and uploaded your consciousness to another brain, that somehow you ceased being you and that thing started being you. I mean, it's not possible. Clearly that thing, that the uploaded consciousness body, is not identical with you, right? It's not the same thing. It's a copy of you. Remember, like we're talking about numerical identity, not when I say same shirt, I'm not talking about two shirts that look the same. I'm talking about one single shirt with two people in it, right? In this case, I'm talking about one single identical thing across time. It seems like in this case there are now two things with the same memories, the same psychology. They're both psychologically continuous with you at an earlier time, but now what gives. Similarly, we've got even like larger variations on the case, right? So imagine a slightly different version. In the slightly different version, we've got this newfangled transportation machine. It's a transportation machine in quotes because instead of transporting you through like a fold in space time where like, you just walk through a portal and like you actually show up in the other place, like Rick and Morty style or something like that. In this case, what happens is the transportation machine scans you through a process of like disassembling your body, right? It disassembles your body and scans like every layer. And then it sends all that information from here in Santa Barbara to like, another machine that's in New York. And then that New York machine uses, the atoms that it has available to it to kind of put you back together. So the idea is like, the scan, like the atoms don't get like zapped from one side of the world to the other instantaneously. That would be impossible. Here, the idea is that, at the faster than the speed of light, or at the speed of light, the information that is the structure of your body is zapped from Santa Barbara to New York, and the machine is, while the machine over here is deconstructing you, this machine over there is putting you back together. right? So now it seems like, if you get transported in this way, that, I don't know, if you have a certain intuition, it seems like you go where you've been transported, right? Where you got put back together, that's you now, right? So if you get into the transporter and it disassembles you, and then you get put back together in New York, then it looks like you transported from, Santa Barbara to New York, right? But wait, what if the transporter malfunctions? What if there's two transporter locations, one in New York and one in Los Angeles, and the transporter sends both the Los Angeles and New York locations the copy of your information? So while you're being disassembled in Santa Barbara, there is a version of you in New York being reassembled and a version of you in Los Angeles being reassembled. Now, in that case, the idea is supposed to be here, like, look, oh, these two copies are both put together. They both are psychologically continuous with you. They both have all of your memories, and I mean, in a sense, they both are you. But in what sense? Like, but which one is actually you, right? I mean, it's not possible for both of them to be identical, right? One of them is in New York, and one of them is in Los Angeles. So New York version of you is located in New York. Los Angeles version of you is located in Los Angeles. Well, remember, according to Leibniz's law, those are two different properties. One's in New York and one's in Los Angeles. It can't be that something that's in New York is also in Los Angeles at the same time, because those are different places, right? So uh, whew, so which one is you? It seems like they're both psychologically continuous with you. So according to the psychological continuity view, they both are you. But which one is you really? Like, it's like the ship of Theseus case again, right? In a certain weird way. Um, the things get split off, and now we've got two things that seem equally plausibly you, but they can't both be you. And so it's really, just hard to say um, uh, what who's you. It's just hard to say. Or let's see. Well, okay, so now let's elaborate even further. More fission cases. What if the machine scans you, but it doesn't disassemble you? And instead, so right as it scans you, it's just scanning you. You're not being disassembled. It scans you, and then as it scans you, a copy of you is being made in New York. Right now, it seems like, okay, so you get into the machine, you get out of the machine, you're still in Santa Barbara. But at the same moment you get out of the machine, a copy of you gets out of the machine in New York. Now, this seems like a very similar case, kind of, to the LA New York case. It's just, in this case, it seems more obvious, I think, right, that you are still the one that's in Santa Barbara, and there's like a copy of you that's in New York, right? But in both cases, the you that gets out of the machine and the you that in Santa Barbara and the you that gets out of the machine in New York, both of you are psychologically continuous with you before getting into the machine. And so that seems problematic, because if the view is true, then according to the view, then both of you are identical with you before you got into the machine. And that's, again, by Leibniz's law, that's problematic, because one of you's in Santa Barbara and one of you's in New York. And so it seems impossible to say that that the one of you is identical to the one of you beforehand, is somehow identical to, numerically identical to, the both of you after the fact. So that's even worse. Another example, right? And I think this is the last one that I have for right now. Imagine, the machine disassembles you and sends a copy to New York, but then it malfunctions like a day later and sends a copy from the day before to LA. So, like, the copy of you walks out in New York, and then a day later, another copy of you walks out in Los Angeles. But it's got like a day lag on memory and stuff. Well, that seems even weirder, right? Because now you've got these like two copies of you that are out there, but one of them is psychologically immediately continuous with you, and one of them's got like a day long lag in between. But it still seems like it's psychologically continuous with you. It's just psychologically continuous with you a day before. So now, which one's identical to you? Oh, it's again, complicated mess, difficult to think about. One thing that might be worth thinking about in a sense is just that, this kind of transporter that doesn't, just like actually allow you to move from one place to another. It actually has to disassemble you. Maybe you just don't survive, right? But if you don't survive the transportation, like it seems like the psychological continuity view has got to be false, right? Because in this case, we're just sort of stipulating that the copies are psychologically continuous with you, whatever that means. They have the same memories as you. They have the same experiences that you've had. They have the same desires. They have the same underlying psychological components to keep themselves conscious and so on. So it seems like if whatever the psychological continuity view is, if you deny the transporter cases, then it seems like that view's got to be wrong. All right, finally, this brings us to the fission argument. The fission argument is the master argument from these cases to show that the psychological view continuity theory is false, right? And here's basically what this is it's a big modus tollens style argument. A modus tollens style argument goes like this. It says you've got a conditional statement, if P then Q, and then you deny the consequent. You say not Q. And so if you deny the consequent, you say, okay, so if P then Q, not Q, then you have to deny the antecedent. So if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And that's going to work. So the conditional statement is going to be the first one, number one. And then everything else is going to be basically a way to get to number 8, which is ultimately then going to allow us to deny all of 1. All right. So here's what here we go, right? If the psychological continuity theory is true, then if person X is psychologically continuous with person Y, then X is identical with Y. All right, that sounds right. X and Y here are just like placeholders for any two persons that you want to put in. To premise 2, A is psychologically continuous with B, right? So from the fission case, we'll say A is you in Santa Barbara and B is you in New York. 3, so if the psychological identity theory is true, then A is identical with B, right? So this is from premise 1 and premise 2, where we're putting in A and B for X and Y. And so we're just basically keeping, this part at the beginning that says if the psychological identity theory is true, then it's got to be the case that A is identical with B. Because, we're not 100% sure on whether that's true yet, but if it's true, then A is identical with B, because that's what follows from, what's going on here. And it's true, we're assuming that A is psychologically continuous with B from the case. Premise, so 3 is a subconclusion. Then we've got premise 4. A is psychologically continuous with C, and that's from the other fission case, right? So we'll say C is the version of you that's in Los Angeles. So A is psychologically continuous with C. 5. So if the psychological identity theory is true, then A is identical with C. And this comes again from 1 and 4 now, right? So we've got subconclusion 3 and subconclusion 5, which come from 1 and 2 and then 1 and 4. All right, now here's where things get a little bit trickier. There's the law of the transitivity of identity. It sort of mentioned it earlier. The law of the transitivity of identity says that if X is identical with Y and Y is identical with Z, then X is identical with Z, right? Anytime you've got transitivity, the first two things are transitively related, then the first and the last thing are transitively related, right? So that's what's going on here. And we're still, again, we're talking about numerical identity here. This is the transitivity of numerical identity. If X is Y and Y is Z, then X is Z, and there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Premise 7. So if the psychological identity theory is true, then B is identical with C. That follows from 3, 5, and 6. So 3, remember, says if psychological identity theory is true, then A is B. 5 says if psychological identity theory is true, then A is C. And 6 says if X is Y and Y is Z, then X is Z. And so now here, basically what we've got is, taking the A and the B from 3 and the A and the C from 5, we just swap, we swap B for C, or I mean B for A in one of them, and we end up with 7. All right, so ending up with 7, if the psychological identity theory of true is true, B is equal to C. But given the case, we know that it's not the case that B is equal to C. B is not identical to C. The person that's in New York coming out of the teleporter is not the person that's coming out of the teleporter in Los Angeles. And that's just by Leibniz's law, right? Leibniz's law says it's not possible for two things to have different, or for one and the same thing to have different properties. So if two things have different properties being located in whatever place, then they just can't be the exact same thing, right? So that gives us 8 there, gives us the denial of the second half of part 1, right? Basically, it says that it's not the case. So assuming that the psychological continuity theory is true, it's going to turn out that B has to be identical with C, but that's not true. So ultimately, we can go all the way back into denying the first part of premise 1. This is a big modus tollens move, and so we find out that it's not the case. It's not true that the psychological identity theory is true, right? So the psychological identity theory is not true. All right, that is a big, long mess and difficult argument to get through, but hopefully you followed up to now and are still interested. I mean, I think that this argument's really good. It's almost a knockdown argument against the psychological theory. So, how could you possibly argue against this argument, right? So, suppose you like the psychological theory and you're like, oh man, I don't like the soul view because I want, it to be the case that, but, I like being a materialist, but I think that really what we are is our psychology, and I like the body swap examples, and I think that that's plausible. I also think that maybe in the future we can upload our consciousness onto the internet or something like that, and continue to live on forever. So I like the psychological view. So if you like the psychological view, then you need to deny the fission argument. If you're going to deny the fission argument, you have to pick a premise to throw out and say why it's false. So how are you going to do that? Well, this argument is pretty devastating. It's a really strong argument, but you have a couple of options to argue against the argument. So first, though, problems with arguing against the argument. It would be a little bit disingenuous to try and deny premises 2, 4, or 8. 2, a psychologically continuous, A is psychologically continuous with B, 4, A is continuous with C, and 8 says it's not the case that B is identical with C. Those both come from the setup of the argument, right? The setup of the example. So you can't really deny those. It also seems like you really just shouldn't deny Leibniz's law or the transitivity of identity. Those are both really plausible. And you get into some really hairy situations if you deny those, and I don't really want to talk about them here. Premise 1, you can't really deny because it's just a statement of the psychological view, right? It says that if the psychological continuity theory is true, then, given psychological continuity between X and Y, then X is identical with Y. That's what the view says. So, and then 3, 5, and 7 are all sub-conclusions. They all just follow from the premises before them. So what's left? Like, what is it that you can deny if you can't, if you're not supposed to deny 2, 4, or 8, or 6, or 1, or 3, 5, and 7? That looks like all the premises. So what is it that's left? What can you deny? And what I say is, well, you can always quibble. So you might deny a few different things. You might deny the fission case, right? It seems arbitrary to deny that A is identical with B or with C. And if you did that, you'd have to give some relevant difference between the cases. So what I mean there is, you could deny 2 or 4 in the setup, right? You could say, well, actually, just the, you're only identical with the one of you that goes to New York, or you're only identical with the one of you that goes to LA. And you could deny that. You could say, well, yeah, you really just aren't identical with one of the individuals that ends up on the other end of the teleport. But it seems a little bit arbitrary for you to say only one of them. So if you were to deny that A is identical with B or that A is identical with C, then you would want to give some reason for thinking that it's not arbitrary that A is identical with one and not the other, right? You got to come up with some kind of difference, some difference in the case. And given the case as it's set up, there's really not a whole lot of difference. So this denial, I think, is a little bit too difficult. You might deny that A is ever identical with anything after going through the transporter, right? And the idea here is that you can say something like, well, um, psychological continuity depends on underlying bodily continuity, and so like you need the same underlying body in order to have the exact same overlying psychology. You can have like qualitative copies of yourself in New York and in Los Angeles, but you're not going to have numerically identical copies because the underlying physical stuff just isn't exactly the same. And so then the idea would be the same thing, like, oh, well, yeah, when you upload your consciousness to the internet or to a cyborg, you don't really have the same consciousness. You've just copied the consciousness, and it's like making a copy. And so really the new thing is a qualitative copy, not an exact duplicate. Now, this is a fine response to this argument, but it doesn't really solve the problem because it doesn't actually give you an answer that says anything about identity over time, right? About what it is to be the same person over time. That is, the numerically the same person. Here, you're dangerously close to denying the psychological view itself. And so if you're denying the psychological view, I mean, you can deny the psychological view and claim, oh, really, there are these, copies, but that's not to accept the psychological view at all, really. Here, if you accept this, if you say, well, no one's ever really identical with the thing that comes out of the transporter after they've been disassembled, you end up losing out here on body swap cases in general and on any kind of upload scenario, right? You lose on the body swap cases, which makes the view plausible in the first place, because the underlying psychology, or the psychology, the underlying, bodily structure, the mental structure that needs to be realized in order for the psychology to be the same is going to be different in the two different people, right? You've got two totally different brains in Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis. And so if their psychologies swap, well, then it looks like, the people cease to exist. And that seems a little bit weird, right? You don't really want to say that. I mean, that the body swap cases are supposed to be what makes the psychological view plausible in the first place. And then similarly, yeah, like the upload scenarios, right? If you upload your brain, your consciousness onto some hardware, you're just not going to have the same underlying physical stuff that is realizing your mental processes. So whatever's going on, it's just not exactly the same. So maybe all you can say here is that it's possible for copies of your psychology to be made, and that for those things to be, psychologically continuous with you in a sense, but they aren't really you. And so whatever it means to be, psychologically continuous with you, it actually takes a lot more effort, right? You've got to have kind of the same underlying brain stuff also in order to have the same psychological continuity. This is a way of responding. It's just it just doesn't make the view as plausible to begin with, right? It gets really close to thinking like, well, to what we'll call later the body view. The body view takes what you are to be, or one of the versions of the body view takes what you are to be your brain. And if what you are is your brain, then we don't need to think about you being your psychology. All right, the last possible way out, and this is sort of to bite a little bit of a bullet, but bullet biting is what philosophers like to do sometimes. The last way out is to deny premise 8. And what you do in order to deny premise 8, you don't say that B and C are identical. What you say is that A is in some way now both B and C. And this is a little bit crazy, but it's a way to make the argument. A is now somehow two bodies, right? A is psychologically continuous with two bodies, and so now A is consciousness in some sense has gotten bigger. So A has gotten bigger. And so A is now basically this like multi-conscious organism that is in two places at once. I mean, it's not in two places at once because it's just that it's spread out. It's now a consciously spread out being. If any of you pay attention to like other kinds of science fiction, or there are other kinds of I don't know. There's a Rick and Morty episode about I can't remember the name of the being, but the being is basically like a multi-conscious organism that controls all kinds of individuals. There's also the old book series and somewhat recent movie about what's it called, Ender's Game. And in Ender's Game, it ends up turning out that the alien species is kind of like a hive mind species. There's one mind that controls all of these drone aliens. And in that case, you kind of can think of it that way, maybe, right? It's not the case that A is somehow in control of both B and C from some third location, because A is just, what A is from before getting in the teletransporter. But, after the transporter, we've got these like two individual, bodies, but they've got one unified, continuous conscious psychological state. And even though they're not sharing a conscious state, they somehow are part of one continuous thing, right? This is another way of thinking about how this somehow could go. This is like imagining, in the ship of Theseus case, imagine saying, hey, well, really, both B and C, the two ships at the time T later, they really are the same thing. They're just this big amorphous two-ship blob thing, right? They're this scattered two-shipped entity, and really the original ship of Theseus turned into two ships. The two ships are, I mean, they're not the same ship, but really what the ship of Theseus ends up becoming is a two-ship, whatever that kind of thing is. So is this view plausible? Can you defend this kind of view? Well, maybe. It's a weird view to think about and to take seriously. But for some, with respect to some kinds of objects, some kinds of things, it seems rather plausible, right? So take a cell. Cells tend to split, right? That's how cells, they divide. That's how they cells don't give birth to other cells, they divide. And so it's an interesting question. When you've got a cell that divides, cell division, where did the original cell go, right? So you've got one cell, cell A, and then you've got two other cells, cell B and cell C, that come about after cell A splits. And then there's this question, well, which of C and B is cell A, right? Did A go with C, or did A go with B? Did it go with neither, or is it both? And at least in some cases, right? So some single-celled organisms continue and just stay single-celled organisms, and in that case, it's not entirely clear, I think. But in other cases, organisms that are growing, it looks like when you've got cell division, it's the original organism was a single-celled thing, and then after the cells divide and kind of clump together, you've now got a multi-celled thing, but it's one multi-celled thing, right? And then it goes again, and now you've got one four-celled thing after that, and then it keeps going. It could be, I mean, this would be a wild view, but it could be that what you are is your psychology, and if it's possible somehow for you to become psychologically continuous with multiple things, then you are just this like bigger thing as you grow, like as you become psychologically continuous with more stuff. And this is it's a weird sci-fi type scenario to think about, but if you're grasping it, it's an interesting way to think about it. It's an interesting way out of the argument. It's a little bit far-fetched, but it is interesting. So we end up with these questions like, can our psychology actually work like that? Can we be psychologically continuous with multiple things? And then for us, like, could I be the same thing as this, like, multiple branching psychological continuity tree? Or is it possible for there to be something like collective consciousness, right? Is it possible that, what you are is a collective consciousness, even though you don't really have access to the other parts of your consciousness? That would be strange, too, right? It seems at least like B and C when they come out of the transporter in Los Angeles and in New York, that they have become individual persons, right? It seems like they become individual persons in individual psychologies because they're complete. They're completely just like you. It's not like somehow they're incomplete. So it's sort of funny to think of them as somehow parts of a big psychological entity. In this case. All right, so recap and sort of ending this lecture. This view is, I would say, less worked out than it should be. The psychological view, I think, has more going for it than we're talking about here. But it's really hard to defend, and I think it's really hard to see which premise of the arguments that was given of the fission argument is false. I think it's a really cool idea to think that our psychologies could somehow be passed on or moved around in some way, that they could be like uploaded to other people, to other brains, or uploaded to the internet in some way, or uploaded to some kind of robot type thing, android in the future. But it's an interesting question whether or not it really would be us, and whether or not, like, if my consciousness was uploaded to some android, would that really be me, or would that just be some kind of copy of me? I mean, in a way, my psychological continuity would go on, and that's great. But I mean, if my psychological continuity goes on and I here die, like, well, then I'm not, exactly immortal. That other thing gets to go live its life. But I'm still dead. And so, like, if the psychological continuity theory was like, an attempt at constructing immortality, like, it doesn't really seem necessarily all that plausible. Now, it may be the case that maybe psychological continuity really is all that matters, and so we shouldn't worry so much about identity over time, at least in this case with respect to personal identity. But still, though, at that point, you really have just sidestepped the arguments, and you haven't given an answer. And really, in the end, the answer we're looking for is, what the heck is it that makes me the same person as that child from yesteryear? And that's what I wanted to know in the first place, right? It seems like I am the same thing, and I'm still confused. And this theory hasn't really, if I can't answer the argument, this theory really hasn't given me an answer to that argument, to that question of what am I and what is it that makes me me over time. All right, so that wraps up the psychological theory, and next up we will be talking about animalism.